This is the Details Podcast. My name is Juris, and I am your host. On the podcast, I interview people from whose experience we can learn. And usually, I do it in Latvian. That's because I myself am based in Latvia, which is a country in northeastern Europe with a population of close to 2 million people. This episode is very special in that it is my first and for quite a while will be the only episode I do in English. But the person I met for this episode was just too interesting to pass up. What are we calling I? This question was my first serious introduction to meditation when reading a book called The End of Faith, written by Sam Harris. And the final chapter in the book had a segment which carried that rhetorical question as its title. What are we calling I? Here is a paragraph from that section. If the term I refers to anything at all, it does not refer simply to the body. After all, most of us feel individuated as a self within the body. I speak of my body, more or less as I speak of my car, for the simple reason that every act of perception or cognition conveys the tacit sense that the knower is something other than the thing known. Just as my awareness of my car demonstrates that I, as a subject, am something other than it as an object. I can be aware of my hand or an emotion and experience the same cleavage between subject and object. For this reason, the self cannot simply be equated with the totality of a person's mental life or with his personality as a whole. Rather, it is the point of view around which the changing states of his mind and body appear to be constellated. This was the paragraph that kickstarted my interest in meditation about 7 years ago in 2011. And much more recently, in August of 2018, I had the chance to finally delve deeper into the practice by attending a meditation retreat. The retreat was led by someone who merges two different perspectives on the inner lives we all have. Being trained as a psychotherapist, specialising in psychosexual psychotherapy and trauma therapy, he can competently carry the Western perspective on our inner lives and well-being, and of course the ways to maintain it. But what makes him even more interesting is his perspective from the East. For 45 years, he has studied the nature of the mind through his ongoing meditation practice, and in his pursuit to bring the teachings from the East to us here in the West, he has organized conferences for psychotherapists on topics of use of the self in the therapeutic encounter and played a key role in developing the lay community ALBA, which is the Amaravati Lay Buddhist Association at the Amaravati Buddhist Monastery. It is my great pleasure to welcome to the podcast a mind which is not only full of useful and interesting information, but a mind that also brings a deeper sense to the word wisdom. It is the mind of Nick Carroll. Hi Nick, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Juris. What an introduction.
Well, yeah, I'm doing my worst. Well, thank you very much for coming on. I feel like saying I am very excited to have you on, which is true. But given the context of our topic and also given what I learned on the retreat led by you, it feels more appropriate to say that I feel excitement arising in awareness. Would that be a more mindful way to state that?
More accurate way of saying that's good. I like it.
So yeah, let's start with you and with your, I guess you could say, your beginnings. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in England. I was born in London. I had mixed parentage. My mother came from Poland and my father was English with some German blood and French blood as well. So I'm pretty European in terms of my physiological makeup. But I was brought up in the English culture primarily with a strong influence of Polish values. I went to the French Lycée in London, so I was also exposed to French culture. So I had a pretty rich, diverse input of cultural values and points of view, which I think in the longer term have served me very well, although at the time difficult to put it all together.
Yes, as usual. And where did all the Eastern perspective come into all that? How did you get into meditation?
Well, as in most cases, it's usually suffering, uncertainty, trying to make sense of a world, which on one level seemed to make sense, but everybody had a different perspective on the world. And I found it very difficult to sort of find my own. So my primary state was one of confusion. And so I was looking for meaning. So I read a lot, asked lots of questions of people, but I was pretty confused. It was an interesting experience. I was traveling by train from Warsaw to Vienna, and I met an elderly gentleman who was a professor, Austrian in origin, who worked in China. lived in China, had a family there. He'd got caught there by the Cultural Revolution, and he had to stop teaching anthropology, which is what his subject was, and he could stay there with his family. He was told by the authorities, and he could, if he taught German, so he stayed there as a German language teacher, wasn't able to practice his main speciality, which was anthropology. I was fascinated. This was many years ago when China was still a mystery to the West. And I decided when I came back to England to take up Chinese language. And so I enrolled for a course in Chinese language, and the same college also had courses in Chinese philosophy. And I went to the Chinese philosophy class, and I was just blown away. The man who was teaching was incredibly knowledgeable, and so that's why I picked up I started my sort of more conscious journey in terms of personal practice.
Were the lectures academic in nature? Was it philosophy in the same way we understand philosophy when we talk about Western philosophers?
Well, the thing about Eastern philosophy is very practical, but the emphasis, as I have experienced it, is mainly on experience. The criticism that my first teacher and other teachers have made of Western philosophy is it's very intellectual, and that the real measure of a man is not just how he thinks, but is how he behaves, how he speaks, how he acts and lives in the world. And it seems to me a much more rounded perspective of what a human being can be, rather than having an academic or intellectual understanding of a specific philosophy.
This was actually a huge revelation for me personally when I was reading that book I mentioned in the intro. That was my first encounter. Well, afterwards I just read up on it a bit more, and if I remember correctly, even in the book there were some instructions on how to meditate, and it was my first sort of encounter where I saw that there's actually a lot going on in the head beyond just the intellect, beyond just thinking and reasoning.
Yeah. True.
And what was maybe even a bit more frightening is that how unaware I was of it all the time, and how much control it actually has over you if you are not aware of it.
Absolutely, you very, very true. My initial contact was on one level exhilarating. What I liked about the particular teachings is that essentially one is responsible for one's own destiny. And on the one level, incredibly liberating. On another level, quite terrifying, because where does one start?
Yeah. I think that would actually be a really, really good way to kick off this conversation. Could you just give a brief instruction on how to meditate for someone who has never done that, and what is something that one could expect when meditating for the first time?
Well, I think it's very important to put meditation into the context of everyday life. Meditation basically is slowing down and noticing what's happening. We get very caught up in the flow of life, of the relationships, of the issues that we confront, and it can get very confusing. So the basic thing is to sit still, be still, basically. Start quietening down one's personal environment so that the attention, instead of being focused on all the things that we have to do, on our plans, on our duties, responsibilities, is to start actually noticing what's happening here. And that takes a bit of practice. But I think it's very important to realize that an essential foundation for good meditation practice is having a good life. And by good life, I don't mean a happy, clappy life with lots of possessions and nice things happening. It means a good life in terms of an ethical and a moral life. Because what you spoke about, discovering how many things inform us, we have a whole mass of unconscious desires, fears, anxieties, drives, lusts, which actually control us. We like to think that we're in charge, but we're not in charge. Our basic instincts are primarily in charge, and they express themselves in everyday life. So having a tidy moral life, an ethically based life, one which is based on generosity, on kindness, on honesty, on truthfulness, is an essential part of the meditative path. So I'd start with, is your life in order? What are your relationships with the people that you live with or share your life with? How do you communicate? Do you communicate truthfully? Do you communicate in a respectful way? Are you kind and generous with other people? If not, that's where meditation starts. Because once one tidies up one's emotional life, which is what these sort of guidelines, ethical guidelines are all about, then one can start exploring and discovering the peace which underlies all of experience.
I'm thinking also in terms of what to do. So looking from the outside, when the average Westerner looks at a monk, the first impression is that they are just sitting around. And so what are the things you have to do internally?
Well, observe what happens when you do sit around. For a layperson, one's life practice is in the world that one lives in. A monastic goes into monastic life. Their whole life is geared to meditation, but also to living in community, to dealing with the things that we all deal with every day, how to look after a body, how we relate to the environment, to other people. So on some level, it's very, very similar. What they don't have is the responsibility of finding how to survive in the way that a layperson might. So their duties will be different to your duties or my duties, where we have to earn a living in one way or another. But in terms of the sitting practice, it's essentially exactly the same. It always comes down to observing the phenomena that we're experiencing and seeing what we can learn from observing it.
I remember this was also on the first day of the retreat in the evening. Well, I guess I should just tell to the people that the regimen in the retreat was we woke up every morning, we meditated with a couple of breaks in between, and in the evening there was something like a Q&A with you where we could ask you questions. Mm-hmm. And after the first day, so my first question to you was also just I was saying I'm not sure whether I'm doing it right, because up until now when practicing at home, I usually just paid attention to my breath, and I noticed that my mind starts wandering, and then I just came back to the breath. But that kind of introduction felt sufficient for me for a 10-minute practice. But if I have to do it in total 9 hours a day, something kind of felt a bit off, and it felt like there should be something more to do, or it should just in some way be different. During the retreat, my question was, so I'm just not sure whether I'm doing it right, and I'm noticing that I am just confused. And your answer was, well, yes, be aware of the confusion.
Absolutely right.
which at first, for about half a second, I thought, yeah, that doesn't really help me. but yeah, once you kind of get into the hang of it, and you start noticing that whatever comes up is just what comes up. That actually becomes helpful. And also your distinction between the small mind and big mind helped a lot there as well. Good. So maybe you could just delve into that a little bit. What is big mind?
Well, maybe we're jumping ahead a little bit too far. I think It's good to come back to what you're talking about, the practice. Okay. Because our minds, through the demands of evolution and survival, are always focused on objects which might be pleasing, beneficial, rewarding, or fearful, frightening, and threatening. Our whole psyche is set up to being aware of objects, of phenomena of one type or another. When we've taken care of the basic necessities of life, the phenomena that attracts us is entertainment, things that basically are more about enjoyment, and avoidance of things that interfere with that enjoyment. And then if we happen to be so inspired, we can start thinking about life, reflecting on life, and basically having a rich intellectual life. The practice of meditation is about training the mind to sustain attention. The challenge is that there's very little to pay attention to. We don't have earplugs, we don't have iPhones, we don't have entertainment. We just sit with just being in the present moment. There are several reasons for that. One is to train our attention to stay present, irrespective of whether there is something entertaining or not, irrespective of whether it's pleasant or unpleasant. So it's sort of cultivating a sort of patience and endurance of dealing with lack of stimulation, staying awake in that, dealing with all the states of mind that arise when we don't have anything fixed to focus on. That actually becomes very useful later on. When one starts going into sort of deeper states of meditation, because sustained attention is the key. The other thing that it does, by taking away extraneous objects in terms of the focus of attention, something that is very immediate and present, it keeps us in the present. There's only one reality, and it's happening now, and it's always now. And so by focusing on something like the breath, one is first of all giving the mind an object to pay attention to stick to, like a reference point, like an anchor. but for a longer term gain. As the mind starts quietening down in terms of its mental activity, the emotions come and go, things settle, we can actually start experiencing very deep states of profoundly blissful meditation. It takes a while to get there. The more we look for it, the less likely it is to happen because we're looking for a mental object, but it will eventually happen. And then in the sort of final stage of meditation, when I say final, I mean the sort of the deepest meditation, one allows that attention to remain focused on itself, as it were. So we attend to being attentive. We remain aware of being aware, at which point no object is necessary. We're actually living in the flow of life exactly at the point where we become something or not. We observe the process of becoming and ceasing. We're at the interface of consciousness, of pure awareness, and the phenomena that arises in it.
This is very interesting and definitely useful. But I feel like for somebody who has not meditated, this starts getting into the realm of I just don't know what he's talking about.
Absolutely.
Because having been to the retreat and having had at least a daily practice for a while now, I feel like I understand very well what you mean and what you are talking about. So I would just like to point out to the listeners that if you're listening to this and feeling confused and not sure what Nick is talking about, that's fine. And maybe even just try doing a 10-minute guided meditation and then continue listening to the podcast.
Yeah.
Because the things that happen during while you are meditating is as Nick just said, you pay attention to the object, mostly to the breath. Your mind starts wandering, and then you just bring it back, and that's just that.
Thank you. Yeah, that's absolutely right. One has to start at the basic, at the bottom rung, as it were, of the ladder. And doing what you suggest is absolutely the right thing to do. And I'd suggest persevere, sit for 10 minutes a day, every day, and just develop that as a practice, and just observe how you experience it. Guaranteed, after 2 weeks of doing that consistently, you'll start noticing a difference. And what you're doing is training the mind to pay attention. You start noticing more. More stuff seems to come into awareness. Yeah, it can get very unpleasant sometimes, very uncomfortable. But 10 minutes is not going to kill anybody. Invest the time.
Yeah. Does it matter what your object of meditation is? Usually people recommend the breath, but can sounds be okay? For example, the feeling of your back touching the chair?
Breathing is good. The body does it automatically. It doesn't require conscious effort to breathe, unless one's suffering from emphysema or some kind of lung disorder. It has a nice cycle to it. It has a beginning. It goes to a peak, comes to an end, there's a pause, then the out breath, so there's a nice circular structure to it. So there's an element of something moving and changing, yet at the same time it's also incredibly immediate. One can actually be aware of the sensations of the breath. As the breath crosses above the upper lip into the nostrils, one can notice it in the nostrils, one can notice it flowing down the windpipe, through the heart region and into the lungs. So it's all very, very immediate. Meditating on something which is physical, a sense on the physical level, is incredibly useful because it keeps us present on the body level. It also keeps us out of our head, because the problem is thinking comes in. And before we know what's happening, our mind has wandered off. We're thinking about the meal we've had or the meal we're going to have, the person we're going to meet. All the dramas of life start being replayed. Mm-hmm. And so disengaging from that and paying attention to the breathing actually keeps us very present. But yes, one can meditate on a part of the body. You can meditate on the heart region and notice what it feels like in the heart region. In the Taoist tradition and the Chan or Zen tradition, one will meditate on a point a couple of inches below the navel. I think for Westerners it's a very good place to practice, actually. The heart or the lower belly is a good place to practice. It takes us from our heads. We're too much in our heads. And basically, on one level, it's very pleasant, rewarding, but it actually messes our lives up. So finding a center point in the body and paying attention to that on a sustained level starts releasing, or not releasing, but one doesn't waste so much energy, basically. And what it does, it gives us a centered perspective, which is much more embracing of phenomena. It increases one's ability to be aware, essentially. And it gives us a lot of rest from the thinking mind. You can meditate on sound. very much so. There are meditations on sound. You can meditate on objects as well, literally physical objects, like there are meditations on a burning candle or a point that one may choose to think of or imagine.
So that would be just looking at the object, yes?
It could be looking at an object, absolutely. What sometimes happens with sustained attention, one can develop something called a nimitta, which is basically like a visual object in the mind. When the eyes are closed, it can be a blue light or a white light. One just sustains attention on that. The purpose of these exercises or meditation, which is called concentration meditation, is to train the mind to focus attention. What happens inevitably is, of course, there's a lot of other stuff going on which we can also pay attention to. And our awareness is basically like a torch beam. It can either focus on something very narrow, or it can actually take on a broad perspective. There are different modes of meditation. They tend to give different results. But that's sort of going a little bit deeper into the difference between vipassana practice and samadhi practice.
I feel like different objects of meditation, they kind of bring their own baggage. The breath, I think, was very nice because it's quite easy to focus on the breath. And if your mind drifts away, the moment you notice that your mind has drifted, it's pretty easy to come back to the breath because it's simple. You just know where the breath is. And I mean, everybody knows what it's like to what it's like to breathe.
Yeah.
But when focusing, for example, on knee pain was also an object for me during the retreat because, the sittings in the retreat, we were all sitting, pretty much on the floor, and each different positions of sitting were basically a choice between pain in your ankles, pain in your knees, and pain in your lower back. At least that's the impression I got. But whenever I took knee pain as the object of meditation, it kind of pain has a different nature to it. It's kind of more intrusive in your awareness. It kind of you can't really, you kind of just suffer from it. You can't really drift away from it. You can, at least for a young practitioner like me, it was just too loud. It was like being in a really loud room, and it was impossible to listen to your inner voice when the speakers are beating you.
It's a very good analogy, and that's why it's essential to be relatively comfortable in one sitting. Start off and make yourself comfortable, because the tension that can come with pain is disruptive and will interrupt your ability to develop your meditation practice. At the same time, the pain will come sooner or later, because what's very interesting, the initial discomfort that one experiences when starting meditation, of sitting in an uncomfortable or what may feel a relatively unfamiliar position for a long period of time, is physically uncomfortable. But the body can adapt to that. What is interesting to notice when one practices for a longer period of time, that one starts developing other aches and pains which are not apparently related to the posture one is in. And they could be described as more psychological symptoms of pain. Our emotions are a form of energy which is held by the body, and whatever tensions, unconscious tensions we have become very, very apparent when we sit for longer periods of time, even though when we may be nominally relaxed, actually we have underlying points of tension in the body, and meditation will reveal them. They will become apparent sooner or later. All the while, what we're doing is essentially bringing whatever we are into awareness, with all the baggage that you described, so we brought into life or have acquired in life or accumulated in life, all that will become apparent. So it's really taking the saying, get to know yourself to the max, basically. That's the process of awakening. This is what meditation is about. It's about waking up to what it actually is and not how we want it to be.
Yes. This also relates to another distinction you made during the retreat. It was we have to distinguish between the fact of being aware of something and the contents of awareness.
Correct.
Yeah, and this was also, I found it to be very, very helpful. You actually brought this up as a response to my question about when I said that I'm not sure whether I'm doing it right. Yeah, you pointed out that there are two different things. One is the fact of being aware of something, and then there are the contents of awareness.
Correct.
Usually we get caught up in the contents of awareness.
Almost always.
Yes. But usually, I mean, 99.9% of your waking time. You think about your to-do list, your, I don't know, maybe regrets or some relationships or anything.
Absolutely right.
during the retreat, you also spoke a little bit about what your first retreat was like. And it was it sounded a bit like a real trial by fire. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I was suffering all the things that you've described. I was very committed. I was very determined to practice, very idealistic, and I put a lot of energy into it. And I just grew increasingly frustrated and distressed by the fact that I just couldn't keep with my breathing. My mind kept on wandering. When it didn't wander, I was falling asleep. When I wasn't falling asleep, I was angry. And this was I can't remember, it was a 10-day or 14-day retreat, actually. But it was a long retreat with a lot of sitting. We were starting very early in the morning, finishing late at night, with a wonderful teacher called Dhiravamsa, who was a Thai monk from the age of 13 or something. Very young boy. He ordained as a monk, had been in the monastic order for most of his life and had disrobed at the time that I went to his retreat. And at one point, I just, it was a very open retreat. People were encouraged to share their experiences. I like to regard myself as a bit of a stoic and a sort of stiff-lipped, just fight your way through it, don't complain. But I was really beginning to give up, and yet I couldn't give up because I was too determined to practice. So at one point, I said to Dhiravamsa that, this is just killing me. Is there an end to this? This is just relentless. Every hour after hour, no matter how hard I work on it, I just can't control the mind. And he told me a little story about a retreat that he'd been on several years previously in Canada, and that there was an elderly Chinese gentleman there who was in his late 60s. And I'm talking about a retreat like 30, 40 years ago, so I was still quite a young man. And he told me about this man who was also struggling, but he persevered, and on the sort of 7th or 10th day of the retreat had a breakthrough. And I don't know why, but somehow the way this little story was communicated to me sort of inspired me. I don't think it was a sort of competitive thing of because the old man can do it, I can do it as well. I don't think it was that. It was just the inspiration that, it was like an example. I was given an example of someone who sort of hung in there. So I hung in there and I persevered. And then that sort of magical moment did happen. Suddenly, I just was the breath. There was no me, there was no Nick, no person there at all. I just became the breathing. And very interestingly, a sort of part of my awareness sort of recognized this on a cognitive level, saying, maybe this is it. But I noticed that if I went with the thought, this is it, the emotion immediately, the experience immediately changed in its quality. So I just stayed with that sense, this might be it, without making it, this is it. And that set off in train a whole chain of sort of energetic consequences in the body, which in a sense have stayed with me all my life, because it was quite a transformative moment when I suddenly realized how much energy we have, how our energy is part of the universal energy, and it was like a breakthrough experience for me. But it was preceded with a lot of pain, no doubt about it. It was a lot of suffering.
And you said that the format of the retreat, you also had drums and people could just speak out and say what they are feeling?
Yes. It was an original retreat. It was a Buddhist retreat informed by Western psychological sort of, what should we say, perspectives. There was sort of encounter-type group meetings where people just spoke about their feelings, about what was happening to them in the moment. People were allowed to express their emotions as they were sitting, so there was a lot of crying, sometimes shouting, which was all very strange because I'd never done anything like this before. In my particular...
I can imagine.
Yeah. So I just sat through it all, and actually there was something very, very energizing about that style of retreat because things were expressed, and it sort of added a dynamic quality to the practice. What was interesting, that Dhiravamsa at that time, he'd written one book already called The Way of Non-Attachment, a superb little summary of Buddhist teachings. He was also at that time writing another book called Dynamic Meditation. And essentially, I and the others on that particular retreat were probably doing what he called dynamic meditation.
You mentioned the not sticking to the sense of achievement. And that's also something, I think, very counterintuitive to most Westerners and most go-getters.
Yeah.
What is the idea behind that? What's the idea behind not sticking to some sense of achievement when you get your first breakthroughs or just new experiences?
Well, the basic message is enjoy what's happening, but realize that it's transient. It has no permanency. So you can enjoy the sense of achievement, but don't get attached to it. Notice that it has a quality. It comes into existence and then it passes out of existence. It basically, the cause of our suffering is that we hold on to things, either the things we've got that we don't want to lose, or we want to get rid of things that we don't want in order to get something that we do want. There's a constant holding on to something. And essentially, we're trying to cultivate an equanimous state of mind, which allows us to be with things as they are without interfering with the process. So it gives us a sense of objectivity. The moment we have contact with something pleasurable, the instinct is to hold on to it. But the more we hold on to something that essentially is going to change sooner or later, the more likely we will be disappointed. And that's basically the truth, and it's an existential truth. It's not a truth invented by the Buddha. He identified that existence is suffering. There is suffering. It's just a fact. The suffering is caused by our clinging, by our desire, by wanting things to be one way or another. His first primary insights. And the third noble truth is his experience that actually one can let go of it. But to let go of it, you have to, as it were, change the way you live your life. Be curious about the life that you lead. Question the assumptions. And lead a moral, ethical life, which means the way you speak, the way you communicate to yourself and towards others, the way you act in your own personal life and in how you act towards others, the livelihood, how you make a living, what are the implications, what does it do to your mind, what does it do to other people. So it's basically responsible relational living. And then the effort. What does one put one's energy into? Do I put my energy into things that are helpful or wholesome, or do I put my energy into things which might give me pleasure but actually short-sighted, unwholesome, unhelpful? And then that takes us to mindfulness practice. In other words, awareness is key, mindfulness is key, because if we're not aware or not mindful of what we're doing, how can we change anything? We're just victims of our drives and our fears and our anxieties and desires. So right effort is critical in helping us make the decisions that are conducive to a healthy, wholesome, emotional state of mind, which gives a good platform, a good foundation for meditation practice.
Just to play devil's advocate here,
sure, please do.
For a second.
Please do.
Yeah. If the point is not to cling to anything,
yeah.
So if you have some new experience, some new breakthrough, and if the instruction you have to follow is just let that pass, so the question here might be, okay, but then what am I going towards? Because any new breakthrough or new experience that I will get, I will just have to let go. So am I not just spinning my wheels here?
No, it's a good question, but actually non-attachment is allowing things to be the way they are, and then you respond in response to that. So it's all about the context. I can let a bus go by. If I'm standing in the middle of the road and I let the bus carry on and I'm standing in the middle of the road, I'm going to get killed. So I'm going to get out of the way. So it's not a question of not doing anything. It's a question of being a witness to it and reflecting on the motives, on the intentions of what we do, how attached we are to a particular state of affairs. To live in the world, we have to deal with the world as it is. It's a question of what the primary intentions are. Is it just to survive, or is it to take advantage of people? So basically, it implies a sense of sort of taking responsibility. In other words, the ability to respond correctly to the situations we find ourselves in. And the stickiness, the sticky part is the fact that we like to hold on to things even when everything is going the other way. So it's about encouraging intelligence. There's nothing wrong with enjoying life, but accept that at the end of the day, the sun's going to set, it's going to get cold, and you need to change your environment rather than dreaming about a lovely day. You can have the fond memory of the day, but it's going to come to an end. Enjoy it. Be in the moment, literally, and enjoy the beauty of life when it's dark or when it's bright and sunny. So actually, it frees one up.
The point about being freed up, I think that's really key, because it's at some level, it is intrinsically pleasurable to be able to just let go and just witness what's going on and what's happening. And I could almost say that you are less of a slave to your own reflexes that you have been just following unconsciously pretty much your whole life.
Correct. As long as you are in control of impulses which are driven by craving, by lust, by desire, because we're not free until we're free of that. Then we're prisoners of our drives. Yeah. So yes, it's very easy, very nice to sort of just let the world go by, and we can do that on holiday. But it's not sustainable for a very long period of time. And actually, is it very helpful? It can be very self-indulgent. Well, I think that most of us have a sort of inner sense of what's what. That we have that sense of intuition that actually I'm indulging here. I'm just sort of basically just chilling out so much that I'm just becoming a couch potato. At that point, something uncomfortable starts. Recognize it. How am I spending my time? So basically one is just aware of all these subtle processes much more acutely if one meditates and develops awareness, at which point we have more data with which to live in the world.
This is something I tell to people who, when I'm now asked, what did I get out of the retreat? So what are like the top 3 takeaways when somebody asks that kind of question?
Yeah.
This is for me, I think I guess you could say the most useful takeaway or the most impactful, that you notice your moods arising. So you're not just overwhelmed by anger or even by happiness for that matter.
Yeah.
But you kind of notice it arising. And it's the analogy. I think I read this somewhere a while ago. It's the difference between being on the surface of a stormy sea or being at the bottom of a stormy sea. So when you are at the surface of a stormy sea and you're a small boat, you are just being pushed around by all the waves and the wind and just everything that's going on.
Correct.
But when you can notice your moods arising, you're like a submarine at the bottom of the sea, and you see on the surface that there's a lot going on there, but you're not overwhelmed by it. You're not a slave to all those waves.
It's a very nice analogy. And how does that feel?
Good.
Exactly.
It feels like you're in control. Yeah.
Well, yes, in a control in a nice way. Yes, you're basically present to what is happening, and control. Yes. I wouldn't perhaps use the word control, but there is a deep pleasure in just being equanimous and aware of a process and not being a victim of it. And that's one of the fruits of meditation. Yeah.
By the way, on this question of using the word control, I noticed that words take on slightly different shades from the usual meaning when we talk about meditation. When saying control, I don't mean like control in kind of a controlling manner where you are, I don't know, the CEO of a big company and you kind of want everything to go your way. But control in different ways.
Well, what it does, let's just stay with that because it's important. Another word which might sort of give it that slightly different angle or perspective is you have greater agency. You have more. You have more choice. You have more choice essentially, and it's beautiful.
A couple of other words that I think you are using in kind of a non-traditional manner, at least looking from a Western perspective. The word insight.
Yes.
Now, usually when in the traditional sense, the word insight, I think, means having a great idea, noticing some great pattern. When, say, you're a mathematician and you are looking at tons of data and suddenly you go, there's this eureka moment where you notice some new pattern. So that is, I think, the usual sense of the word insight. But when you were saying it, I feel like you have some different thought behind that. Maybe you could go into that?
Well, maybe not. I think it overlaps with what you've just described. There is definitely an aha moment, a sudden recognition of a pattern and the significance of that pattern and how that pattern fits into the bigger order of things. And the reason it may have a different quality, possibly, is that it's not just an intellectual sort of aha. It's actually also an emotional aha. So it's basically an alignment of intellect and feeling and intuition, a sort of emotional recognition. My gosh, this really is an aha. It's really sort of on the heart level, which is actually represented, also reflected in the understanding of it. And sometimes the understanding can't even put a word to it because words are always secondary. All ideas are always secondary reality. The primary reality is the immediate experience, and even that has a primary reality, which is the awareness in which it arises.
Another word that I think you are also using in kind of a non-traditional way, you could say, is the word wisdom. Now, again, my impression is of the traditional meaning of the word wisdom is knowing what the right thing is to do. So kind of just being the wise old person who can guide you through life, and that's a person that has wisdom and can lead you towards the good life. I guess that's how you could describe wisdom. Now, when you say the word wisdom in a meditation context, is that something else?
Well, no. Again, it overlaps with what you're saying. Wisdom, which is, I think, can be analogous to insight, is basically seeing the nature of phenomena and what its characteristics are. It's impermanent, always changing. Whatever we witness on the physical level, mental, emotional, even the spiritual level is always changing. There's nothing fixed to it at all. And because of that, there is suffering, because we're constantly getting trapped in one form or other of attachment. Yeah. But it all leads to the sort of fundamental insight, the core insight that the Buddha offered, is at the heart of it all, there is no individual, there is no self. There's an individual process, yes, but the insight that arises sees that everything is just a process. It's conditions giving rise to conditions. We happen to be a particular complex form of conditions, but essentially there's nothing there. We're there, in a sense. I can see an iPad and I can see your face on it. I can see my body here. And it's true. It is there, but it's only here in transient form. There's nothing fixed, permanent, with any core sense of identity in anything that we witness, including our sense of self. And that's really quite a profound insight to come to, because it basically deconstructs and demolishes our sense of self, but not in a damaging, psychotic way where there's a disintegration of personality. Quite the opposite, actually integrated into a perspective which suddenly realizes that all of life is just a movement of processes, but where it's happening is indescribable, which is why the Asian traditions and non-theistic traditions are so wonderful, because they don't speak of God. They speak of emptiness. They speak of the unconditioned. They speak of the deathless. They speak of the timeless. They use all their language to say what it is not, but never say what it is, because the moment it's defined as something, it becomes an object. And the moment it becomes an object, it falls foul or becomes victim to all the things that happen to objects. Attitudes, positions, views, and all the rest of it.
You briefly mentioned the phrase conditions giving rise to conditions.
Correct.
A phrase you brought up quite a lot in the retreat was the conditioned existence.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, what that is.
Well, we live in a conditioned world, a world which is dependent on senses, on the interaction of events. If we look at the world as we experience it, we can see that it's all interconnected, but that things arise in dependence on conditions. You and I are here because our parents made love. Where did our parents come from? Well, from their parents making love. How do we exist on this planet? How do we exist? We're completely dependent on the air, the sun, the rain. It's actually worth reading Thich Nhat Hanh. He has some beautifully poetic descriptions of the interdependence of all of existence. We are always caught up in the phenomena, that is conditions. We define ourselves by the conditions we experience. We're always trying to change conditions and trying to manipulate them, but we're dealing with movable objects, constantly changing objects. So it's a constant struggle on some level. Whilst we're young, we have plenty of energy to do it. But as we get older, it gets exhausting. And even for quite fit people, after a while, it gets a bit tiring. Sort of Groundhog Day again and again and again and again. Just patterns which require energy. So it's to find the timeless in that. Where is all this happening? Where is reality? Reality, the closest we can get to reality is in the present moment. When is the present moment? It's always now. We can't hold on to anything in the present moment for it to change its nature or characteristics. But our awareness of the present moment is always present. And that's where we find liberation. That's where we can find a perspective which allows us to live with this phenomena in a way which doesn't imprison us. And that's what's meant by freedom in certainly the Buddhist sense. Freedom from suffering. So things hurt, but hurt comes and goes. Things that are enjoyable, it comes and goes. Thoughts come and go. Emotions come and go. So it's having a perspective which gives you the big picture, which you can call the big mind, yes, that's where we will find happiness and well-being in a world which is full of suffering. But at least one has found a way out of that suffering, and one knows how to relate to the conditions and the suffering of the world.
One thing which was a rule in the retreat, and I'm assuming it is like that in most, if not all, retreats, that you should maybe not quite deny yourself pleasure, but you kind of get rid of all external stimuli. And is that in some way connected to noticing our reactions to different conditions? Because, well, for example, one of the rules we ate only twice a day. And at least I got hungry for especially towards the evening. Is the purpose of denying yourself those pleasures and those ways to reflexively kind of take care of your wants and respond to them a way to bring your attention to how your mind acts when you can't reflexively take care of your wants?
Good question.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Taking away one meal a day doesn't kill anybody. If anything, it probably makes us a lot healthier because it creates a much bigger gap between the last meal and the next meal, yes, which we know is physiologically very healthy. All it does, it brings our attention to how dependent we are on physical comfort for well-being. It's a sort of form of ascetic practice, you could say, but it's a very, very modest one, just enough to make us reflect on, my gosh, my sense of well-being really is dependent on that meal at 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. What happens when it's taken away? How the whole system gets disorganized. So relinquishment actually is a path of all spiritual traditions, or most spiritual traditions, is to relinquish something, give something up, in order to highlight our emotional and mental dependency on well-being. And once we start playing around with the conditions in a way which is helpful to our practice, it basically gives insight into our own nature, into how dependent we are on our well-being.
This is one of those situations where I have to go back to the story of the fish, the two young fish that swim by the older fish,
Mm-hmm.
and the older fish asks, "Well, hi guys, how's the water?" And one of the younger fish replies, "What is water?"
Exactly.
Yeah, it's kind of our reflexes to take care of our immediate needs is just so present that I think most people don't even notice that it's there.
Yeah, that's very. It's a lovely story. I've always liked the goldfish story.
Another story you mentioned during the retreat was that there is, if I remember correctly, in Scotland, a retreat that takes place 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days.
Oh, right. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and you have two friends that have done
Correct,
that.
Yeah. This is in the Tibetan tradition. The Tibetan tradition organizes a long-term retreat for really committed practitioners. And its duration is 3 years, 3 months, and 3 days. That's absolutely right. And actually there was a preparatory year in which they went and lived in a monastery just to basically prepare them for the retreat.
And you have two friends that have done that.
Correct.
How did they change from your point of view before and after that retreat?
It's a very good question, because they're good friends. And somehow in the conversation that I've had with them since they've come back, the change is subtle. There's a very simple and appealing ordinariness about them. So they're not like surrounded with golden light and floating from one place to another. They're very grounded, very, very matter of fact, and very content with a so-called ordinary life. So I think they went through a lot in those 3 years. I mean, one period I may have mentioned in the retreat, I don't know, but for 1 month they don't wash, for instance. Well, try not washing for 3 days and see what starts happening, let alone a month. Yeah.
Yes.
So I think they went through many experiences there. It required commitment, determination, and practice. It was held in a group setting because you're there's about 10 other people. So there's a collective side and a personal side, but you're cutting yourself from all ordinary life as we know it. And the paradox is it allows them to live an ordinary life, I think, in a much more grounded, matter-of-fact way. And it reminds me of a story. There's a story in the Zen tradition, which there are different versions of it, but essentially, before the training, mountains were mountains, rivers were rivers, and trees were trees. During my training, mountains were no longer mountains, rivers were no longer rivers, trees were no longer trees. After the practice has come to fruition, mountains are again mountains, trees are trees, and rivers are rivers. Basically, the same stuff is just perceived differently, experienced differently, related to differently. That's what meditation does. It changes one's relationship to one's experience in a way which is deeply, deeply rewarding. And in fact, I don't think there's anything more important in one's life than to commit oneself to this sort of inquiry and that sort of realization.
What you just said, I think is really key, that it changes your relationship to your experience.
Correct.
So I think this is really worth underscoring, because it's not like you have some new experience, but you change your relationship to your experience.
Correct. Absolutely.
And just as a disclaimer, I have not gotten that far. I did definitely have some new experiences during the retreat, but I got a taste of what it's like to have a different relationship with your experience. So it's definitely on a different layer than you are usually used to.
I'm pleased. So it means that the retreat has had an effect, which is good. It's important to remember, that you have a teacher, you hear all these things from a teacher, and initially it all goes in on a mental level. It's new, it's exciting, it's interesting. After a while, you hear these teachings again and again, and in a sense, you sort of start wondering, well, I've heard all this before. But what it starts tapping into is a deeper search, where one realizes it's just the practice of pursuing the journey actually becomes the journey itself, the practice itself. So the words sort of take on less importance. What is important is being in the company or presence of someone who has realized the truth to some degree, and that has a sort of non-verbal effect and actually activates something in oneself that actually is tuned into the same wavelength. And because our real nature is the same for all of us, we may not realize it, it's a very, very potent way of developing one's own practice.
Another thing that I think is also very, very important to underscore it is just how much effort it takes. And I feel like with, some postmodernism or something that's going on now where it's kind of cool to be spiritual or something like that, people feel like they can just dress up funny, dance, make weird moves on stage, and that makes them spiritual. But it really takes... at least for me, as the layperson, that 1 week long retreat already took some effort. But I imagine that 3 year and 3 month retreat, that's in a league of its own.
It is indeed.
So it's really hard work. It's probably at least as difficult to put on 20 pounds of lean muscle.
Yeah. It's a very good point you're making. You have to really be interested. You have to really make a commitment, and it does require energy. Because essentially we are a massive energy. It's a question of where that energy is channeled. And it takes energy to channel energy. It takes energy to overcome bad habits. It takes determination to persevere where one wants to give up. And actually the foundation for lay people in their meditation practice is how they live their lives. I've always personally believed that my commitment to my duties, my responsibilities, whether I like doing it or not doing it, was secondary. Doing it to the best of my ability was always the primary driver, and I think that has served me well in my spiritual practice. So the way we relate to the world, fulfilling our obligations, being generous with our time, being generous with our energy to other people is absolutely key to spiritual practices, not just meditation. It comes as a package, and our life is to be lived properly, to live properly in the world. That's what our life is about, or should be about. That's my take on it anyhow.
Do you feel like people with different temperaments might have an advantage or disadvantage when meditating? Because I'm imagining people who are low on neuroticism, meditation could be easier for them. Could that be true?
It could be true, but also it could mean that they don't bother so much because they're already in such a good place. So it sort of cuts in different ways, I think.
Yeah, there's always a catch.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask also about, since you have a psychiatry practice, how does meditation practice complement your techniques that you apply in psychiatry, and maybe how are those different as well?
Psychotherapy, just to correct the word.
Psychotherapy.
It's very closely related. It was very interesting for me because I had sort of parallel lives. I had my life, my spiritual practice with exposure to Buddhist terminology, Buddhist concepts, and I had my therapy practice exposed to the sort of Western models of psychotherapy that I've been exposed to and trained in. And for a while I kept them very, very much apart because I didn't want one to sort of flow too much into the other. At the same time, I could acknowledge the benefits that both have. I just didn't have the understanding to pull them together. And that's been a gradual part of my personal work, to make sense of the whole picture. And what I've understood and realized actually is that the key is being aware, undoubtedly. Helping people to be aware, because awareness exposes us to information. That information then needs to be understood. So basically, awareness is a path to greater understanding. What is helpful, I think, is cultivating greater understanding. I can't really say much more at the moment to that. But there is definitely one informs the other. I think several things which is worth saying, that what are the strengths and weaknesses of both models, if one wants to use that sort of language. I think the Western models are not as good on the so-called overall aim of Buddhist practice, which is realization. Very few Western psychological models, except for the transpersonal, speak about life in those terms. What Buddhist teachings don't have is an understanding of the developmental model of individual human growth and development. And I think there's a meeting point, there's an overlap, there's an interconnectedness between the two. And I find absolutely no problem from moving one to the other. It's finding the language that is most helpful to the people's particular problems or issues and their capacity to understand.
Have you heard of Michael Pollan's recent book, How to Change Your Mind?
No, I haven't.
He looks at how psychedelic drugs are being used in psychotherapy and the overlap there.
Yeah. I've actually read the reviews. I haven't read the book, but now that you're mentioning it, I think I've read the reviews. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a very interesting book, and so he touches on a point there, which is between altered states and altered traits.
Uh-huh.
He doesn't use this phrase. I heard this on the meditation podcast in preparation for this, but I think you mentioned this during the retreat as well. That when people take some psychedelic drug, they have some really weird out there peak experience, and it's flashy lights and fireworks, and then people come back and not much has changed. So that was kind of an altered state for a while there.
Yeah.
But he gives stories in the book about people who, for example, have been trying to give up smoking for years and just weren't able to. But then they take a dose of psychedelic mushrooms, uh-huh. and there's a story about a woman, if I remember correctly, where she just starts going on this trip, and the visual she gets is she was flying over Europe,
yes.
and under her she saw all the ages of Europe pass
yes.
by. So Middle Ages, yep. Renaissance, uh-huh. modern
yep.
days, and all that seemed very, very beautiful
yep.
to her. So then she woke up, and she realized, man, there's so much beautiful things to see in the world. I shouldn't be killing myself with smoking.
Very good.
And she stopped smoking.
Very good, yeah. There's no doubt about it that psychedelic experiences can be life-changing and can have very positive changes. I'd also say they can have some very negative changes. Some people have very negative trips, bad trips, which can actually be quite destructive. So that's one thing. I think because they don't have the emotional stability they're not stable enough emotionally to basically absorb the new experience. But I think that what it can easily do, the ease with which one can have a peak experience with drugs, will make it very tempting to try that again. And of course it can become addictive. And its dependence on a chemical which alters the chemistry of the brain, but it's not generated within the brain just by a good lifestyle and a good meditation practice. So I think it's sort of developing sort of superhuman powers without having the body to actually enact it or sustain it for a long period of time. I had many friends who were into drugs when I was young, and undoubtedly some of them had some profound insights. But if I look, I have reservations. I think I have some doubts about. I think if it's used in the way that they're starting to use them, in a controlled manner with a supportive environment, without the sort of hedonistic element of being in a party and having sort of uncontained environment, I think used wisely, it could probably be very, very helpful. And I can't exclude the possibility of it being incredibly helpful in one's meditation practice as well. But I prefer to stick to the conservative path, the tried and tested path of actually working on one's reactions to what we experience and not just the experience itself. Because it's still, if you recognize, it's still target orientated. I'm after a peak experience. There's an I wanting something. And what we want to do is go beyond that, to recognize that in a field which sees that there's an I, a becoming somebody or something, that immediately the moment you become something, you suffer. Even wanting to become a Buddha will make you suffer because you're creating an identity. Any identity is transient. There is no essence in there.
This is also something I would like to really underscore. It felt like, at least for me, what was the hardest part about meditating during the retreat was this not clinging to those peak experiences. Yep. Because, for example, you could describe it as a peak experience was towards the end of the second day where I'm meditating, and the usual stuff happens. I get lost in thought. My knees hurt. I'm starting to wonder about how long do I still have to do this. So just the usual. It was kind of difficult, maybe even difficult in the way that it felt a bit boring. Mm-hmm. And my eyes are closed during the whole process. And at one point, I just decided to look into the blackness behind my closed eyes. And there suddenly, and I hadn't ever felt this before. It just felt like there's lots of room, like almost as if my head got really big. And but to the listeners, this might sound like the rumblings of a madman, but it felt like my head got really big and as if there's lots of room. And not just that, it felt like I immediately got like something kicked into gear, and the meditation practice just felt much, much smoother. It was really easy to just be and just focus on whatever arises in awareness. But the catch, of course, comes during the next day. My instinct was to get back to that.
Yep.
And which is, of course, a trap.
It is a trap, and it's one which is almost unavoidable. I spent years chasing or looking for a repeat of a peak experience. And I know most people who have had peak experiences go through the same. In my case, it probably lasted about 18 years. So it's basically this core craving for experience. And it's actually almost at the heart of our becoming. In the Buddhist cosmology of becoming, craving for existence is a key one. Yeah. And craving for existence is craving for a sensory experience of some kind. Yeah. And basically, it's almost at the root of being human. And it's very, very difficult because it happens on such a basic, primitive level that you can't control it with the mind. So you'd go into meditation, I'd go into meditation, right, forget about all of that, just be with the breath. Can't help it. This drive, this desire, constantly looking, searching like a sort of radar. Where is that peak experience? Where is that peak experience? And you can almost see it there, and you can't stop it. So you sit with it, and you sit with it, and you sit with it. And it's relentless, and it keeps on going.
What really helped me get over that wanting to get back to that peak experience was I just followed your instruction that you gave me on the first day. I was just aware of the wanting.
Yeah.
I simply noticed that I want this to continue, and I just took the fact of wanting it to continue as another thing in awareness.
Beautiful. Well done.
Well, thank you for instructing me, and I think that really helped me to get some. At least subjectively, they felt like deeper states in the later days.
Yeah.
Because, for example, what I just described just now with this feeling of my head becoming big and just having there lots of space, that was very, very subtle. At that moment, I still was not completely sure whether I'm really experiencing this or I'm just imagining this because, I kind of wanted to get some new breakthrough, and maybe I have just convinced myself that I feel this. But so that experience was so subtle where at the moment I was not sure whether I really feel it or am I experiencing it. But during the later days, I had these kind of heat waves, and I felt like this similar sensation of my head becoming big, but kind of exactly the back of my head, and small twitches in my muscles, and kind of maybe even a lightheadedness. And I was definitely not imagining that. I mean, that was, if I would have those experiences without ever having been to a retreat or without having meditated, and if I would have that during, say, a regular day, I would tell to the people around me, hey guys, I need to sit down for a second. Because I was definitely not imagining that.
There's a whole reorganization of energy takes place, because basically we're letting go of our ordinary self, which obviously has a sort of well-established routine in our brain and in our body. And the moment one starts losing our sense of identity in terms of something familiar, routine, yes, things start happening. Energy starts being released and things start happening like you described. And that is definitely part of deeper meditation practice. But the thing to do, of course, is it's a whole set of phenomena which creates its own problems, because, like you say, we get attached to it. And
yeah, definitely. Yeah. The analogy I felt like so the analogy I have for describing this was it felt like I have to walk on the rope, and that takes a lot of focus, and I have to focus on keeping my balance.
Very good.
And in the analogy, this keeping the balance means paying attention to the breath.
Very good.
And all the fireworks that I just described that came up, those were kind of like a strong wind and a storm that's building up while I'm walking on the rope. And as long as I just stay with the breath and don't pay much attention to the fireworks, which is, by the way, very, very, very difficult, because I kind of want to shop around and see what's going on. And as soon as I would start shopping around and looking at all the fireworks, it felt like that wind from the storm would just knock me off the rope.
Absolutely.
And I would have to start from zero again.
But you see what your analogy is pointing to, the very thing we were talking about, the need to have an object of meditation. In other words, to develop the capacity to sustain attention on one thing, irrespective of what is happening elsewhere.
Easier said than done.
yeah, but the principle is there, you see, and you've actually, you've described the principle at work. Sustained attention on one object keeps the mind stable and allows whatever is meant to happen to happen.
Also, I felt like I had these experiences in regular life, especially during jiu-jitsu. So I practice martial arts for about 4 years now, and the experience is actually very, very similar, because in jiu-jitsu all the fighting happens on the ground and there's just a lot going on and lots of pressure, but still, without that, you have to stay cool under pressure, as the phrase goes. Yeah. And that actually felt pretty, now looking back and comparing those two experiences, those actually feel quite closely related.
They are indeed.
You've heard something about these connection between mindfulness and flow states?
Well, I'm not a physiologist, so I'm not sure about all the physiology of a flow state, but I would suggest that basically it's the result of a beautiful integration of mind and body, essentially, with no interfering factors. So the body's working in full harmony. Mindfulness is a process whereby we integrate parts that are not fully integrated. By just being present with them, we develop less reactivity to what we're experiencing, and therefore we become more present to the process and less caught up in a reaction to the process. So I would suggest that basically allows for a flow of energy, which optimizes the functioning of the body in practice.
And what do you mean by parts that are not fully integrated?
Well, we have all sorts of emotional issues. We have a lot of ideation, a lot of thinking that goes through our mind, and that often interferes with our ability to function emotionally. So that's when it interferes from the thinking side. We also have all sorts of emotional states or self-beliefs, yes, which are an emotional way that we feel about ourselves. That interferes with our functioning as well. And mindfulness essentially allows us to be present to all of these processes and makes us less reactive to them.
So being fully integrated means being more in control of your own reactions, you would say? At least in this
control,
in this case.
Yes, as long as you understand what you mean by the word control, because control can be top down, can be quite forced.
Yeah, more attentive, as you said. Yeah,
more attentive. One is able to regulate one's states more. I don't like the word control because it implies something top down, tyrannical, imposing something. It is more about being able to direct the flow of energy in a way which is integrated with the environment. So basically, one's whole appropriate sense of how we relate to the environment is also enhanced.
I also want to touch on the connection between pain and suffering.
Yeah.
I remember in the retreat you said an example that, for example, if you are cutting your finger while cutting the onions, it hurts, but you don't get angry at your finger and you don't get angry at the onions and, of course, not at the knife either. And I think I get that in terms of that there is no needless emotional outrage towards the situation. And is that the way? Is that what you mean by decoupling pain, physical pain from suffering? And also, does this lack of suffering apply to emotional pain?
Very good question. I like it. Well, there is no doubt that having senses, being sensitive, we experience the impact of the environment on us, whether it's on the body level, and in Buddhist psychology, the mind as well is also like a sense organ. It receives or experiences thoughts which are either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So we experience those states of mind and the states of the body as an impingement on ourselves. What happens, there are certain physical things that we can't avoid in life. A toothache, whether you're a Buddha or an ordinary person, if you have a toothache, you have a toothache. It says in the scriptures that the Buddha suffered from back pain, for instance. Well, many meditators can identify with that, even though they're not enlightened. It's what we do with the pain of physical existence or mental existence that is important. Do we compound it? Do we add to it by the way we react to it, what we construct around it? Our resistance to the pain, we know, increases pain, the experience of pain. That's known physiologically, by medicine. So if we are more accepting of what we're experiencing, we reduce the pain factor, and therefore, in a sense, we reduce the mental suffering that we add to what we experience. So there's no denial of the fact that everybody suffers physically in this world when they suffer physically. It's what we do with it. And it's often referred to, as I think I referred to, the second arrow. We get the first arrow of an event, and then it's what we do with the event. So the way we perceive the event, not just intellectually, but even mentally or emotionally, will affect how we experience it. A very good example of this, of course, is the placebo effect, which there's been a lot of research on. And one thing I'll say which is very interesting about it in a second, but we know that the placebo effect, by changing our perception, we take a pill, which maybe just be sugar or some kind of powder, and suddenly the pain or the ache or the illness disappears. They used to think it was mind over body, which in a way it is. What is fantastically interesting, and it's only recently sort of come to light, is that actually 45% of people can take a placebo knowing consciously that it's a placebo and it works. So we can entrain the unconscious to start believing something, yes, even though the conscious mind knows that it's not true. So that's just an interesting little snippet of information.
That's very spooky.
Yeah.
Regarding emotional pain, do you think mindfulness can also lessen the suffering of emotional pain?
Oh, undoubtedly. The problem with pain or suffering is that we are averse to it. We don't want it. We move away from it. On one level, it's a very healthy response because it takes us away from a source of discomfort or unsatisfactoriness. But a lot of emotional pain is compounded by that withdrawal. It sort of complicates the system a little bit. And from a mindfulness point of view, one has to be quite skillful with this because sometimes pain is overwhelming and we actually do need to protect ourselves from it by dissociating it from it in one way or another. But actually, the more one practices to be with the actual physiological experience of the discomfort, emotional discomfort, which is physically felt in the body, yes, somehow we adapt and we then become less reactive again. We're able to cope with the pain much better. And after a while, the key factor is really insight into the nature of the suffering. Not only are we able to observe our reaction to what we're experiencing, but with insight, we can see that what we're reacting to actually has no essential, unchanging essence in it. It's changing phenomena. But that level of insight requires some practice. And by insight, I mean not only an acknowledgement intellectually that it's a transient piece of phenomenon, but it's the emotional insight into that.
I like how you stress that it's not just an intellectual insight, and this was also something. This was also something I noticed during the retreat, that your instructions are very, very clear. So how do you keep them so clear? Because I mean the theme that you are teaching, it's just so abstract, and you can't really point to someone and say you are doing this right and this wrong. So do you have any tips, or what is your approach to teaching?
Well, it's based on practice. It's based on experience and probably some degree of insight through experience. We know that we can tell ourselves all sorts of nice stories, but reality has a way of cutting through those stories, making its impression. Well, recognize that. That's real. How do we respond to what is real, in terms of a direct experience? Meditation practice allows us to, as it were, experience the experience fully, and observing the nature of that phenomena, that it comes, it hits, it has a peak, and then it passes. After a while, we sluggishly, slowly perhaps start recognizing, this is a changing state. There's nothing fixed here. And we create a certain sort of distance, not dissociated distance, but fully, it's just a more integrated, more managed, better regulated response to what we experience. And the clarity just comes from knowing it to be a fact. If someone's telling me the color's blue and I see it's black, I'll just say it's black. I'm not going to say it's blue. It's very simple. So it doesn't take much intelligence to do that. It's just being truthful to what we perceive, what we see, what we understand, and communicate that as effectively as one can.
I'm also interested in willpower. What do you think is the connection between mindfulness and willpower, and can mindfulness help increase willpower?
Yes, undoubtedly. I have no doubt of that at all together. Willpower can get very easily lost because of scattering of energy, scattering of attention. Yes? Willpower is basically a movement of energy towards some objective. Having clarity about the objective, which mindfulness will contribute to, will clarify the sense of purpose and direction in one's intentions. So yes, it will increase one's capacity for concentration, application, determination as well.
And I remember once reading a book called The Science of Enlightenment. It was written by Shinzen Yang. It was a very, no pun intended, but very enlightening book. He had studied history of religions, and he also was very bad at math his whole life. Through his studies in the history of religions, he became a monk and started meditating, had a very serious meditation practice. And after all his meditation and after he was living with the monks, he returned back to the Western world, and he restarted studying math again, and he noticed that he feels this anxiety coming up as he tries to study math because, he had all these negative associations with it, and he just monitored them, and at least from what he says, it seems like he was not overwhelmed by them. He just observed them, let them be, and that all allowed him to just stay with the math and keep on studying.
Well, that's a good example of how mindfulness or meditation practice can help.
Regarding happiness, now, I feel like happiness is also one of those words that in some way changes meaning when you start meditating. Now, for most Westerners, happiness means happy family, good health, good relationships, a wonderful, fulfilling career. Some people might also include material goods in there. That's the perfect life from the Western point of view, and probably most Westerners who live that way would say that they are happy. Now, is that also the meaning of the word happiness from an Eastern point of view, from Buddhist view?
Well, let's differentiate between the two. In the East, I think most people would probably feel exactly the same as what you describe as Western values. People would like to have comfort, a family, happy relationships, health, enjoy life, basically. When it comes to Buddhism, Buddhism has a slightly more subtle understanding, I think, deeper understanding. You could say there are sort of three levels of happiness from a Buddhist and, in fact, a spiritual perspective. There's the happiness that you've just described, the world of conditions. When conditions are right, we feel happy. May people be happy, may people have a good experience of life. But it's happiness which is dependent on conditions which we've already said are changing all the time, so therefore they're unsustainable. We may fall in love with the most beautiful woman or man in the world, and at one point they're going to change and grow old, grow sick and die. The car we buy may be a beautiful car. When it drives off the forecourt of the new garage where we bought it, it'll start rusting, needs maintenance, eventually falls apart, or is in fact substituted by a new model which suddenly makes the old model appear redundant. So all this happiness and well-being is dependent on changing conditions. The second level of happiness, one could say, comes in the meditative states. When we start disengaging from relying too much on the world to make us happy, we can actually find that mind states can make us happy, which are not dependent on the world so much. But even meditation states, good states, are dependent on meditation, on certain supportive conditions. One can go into a very deep state of meditation on a retreat, but the conditions are ideal on a retreat. It's quiet, no duties, no responsibilities, fears, anxieties aren't triggered. They may be experienced, but they're not triggered by the external environment. But that's like a second level of happiness. It's more subtle. It can be certainly far more long-lasting, because it's a state of mind as opposed to physical objects, but it's still subject to change. From a Buddhist perspective, the ultimate happiness or well-being is one of full insight and full realization, when one actually knows what this world is made of, how it's constructed, how it functions, that change and suffering are inseparable. When that realization is fully accepted and fully understood, one starts tapping in to a sense of well-being which becomes less and less affected by the changing conditions of the world or one's mind. One can even observe one's mind states changing and not buy into them, not see them as actually real. And at that point one starts coming into sort of the highest teachings of any spiritual tradition, which is the sense of what is the absolute, what is really real. Well, actually nothing is really real, everything is transient. And the more we try and stay with that question in our practice, and actually observe what is actually real in this moment. Well, my ideas are real, but they've gone, so that's nothing there. Physically, I'm feeling this certain way. How permanent is it? It's constantly changing. If we observe our experience of the body, there's a constant flow of energies, different sensations, different things are happening. There's nothing fixed real there. It's just a happening. The only thing that is real is our awareness of what's happening. That's the closest we can get to any sense of continuity. Once we start identifying with the state, you can call it a state, can you call it a state? Not really. Just once we start identifying with awareness, we're coming to something absolutely present always, because awareness accepts everything. Bad, good, sad, happy, whatever it is, it arises in awareness. It's what happens subsequently to that. That's where we create our complications and suffering. So it's unentangling ourselves from the meaning that we give to our experiences, insofar as we can see how we give the meaning, but we don't buy into it as an absolute. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it definitely does. There's also something very empowering about making your own happiness or well-being independent of external states.
And I think I'd stress the word that it's not one's own. It's actually a natural state available to everybody. It doesn't belong to anybody. It's something that is recognized because it's inherently there all of the time. It's like, we have noise. Where does noise arise? In silence. Silence is a background. It's always there. It's objects. We look at objects. We don't see the space that the objects are in. Space is always there. We always look at the things that arise in the space or the sounds that arise in the silence. And we gravitate towards that because of our evolutionary development. We have to do that to survive in a threatening environment. But really, the only thing that's real is space and emptiness, actually.
That's a cool way to think about it. And also a useful way.
Well, it's a wonderful way. It's a very liberating way. Because it allows us to live in the world of change, in harmony with this change. Being truly realistic, not cynically realistic, but truly realistic, and aware of all the suffering it gives rise to. So it allows for a compassionate response to it by not getting bogged down in sentimentality or just a do-gooding for some sort of ideal. It's just a natural response to suffering that we all experience, because essentially we're in a system which is a unified system. Everything exists in relationship to everything else. Everything that arises in dependence on other conditions. And it's a completely integrated system. We may not see all of it. We only see a little window of it through our mind-body organism. But once that is actually experienced as a reality, whatever happens to anybody else is actually happening to me in a way, not in a personal way, but in a universal way. And so then one starts having a compassion and a response to other people's suffering, which is quite unconditional. It's a response to their suffering, which is just intuitive and instant. And as the conditions change, so our response changes. So we can go from sympathetic joy of feeling happy for other people's happiness. We can then move to compassion when we see their suffering and have real empathy for it. And then we can also just have a disposition of loving kindness, of kindness, of goodness towards other people, because we don't feel threatened by them. And an essential other emotional response is one of equanimity. When we have wisdom, yes, and we have insight into the nature of phenomena, there is an unconditional acceptance of this is the way things are, which means our response to whatever we experience is based on reality. And our acceptance of the reality of the phenomena allows us to be equanimous, in a state of equanimity and inner peace, which is priceless. Nobody can buy it, nobody can sell it. It's something that arises quite naturally in response to a realistic acknowledgement of what reality is all about.
Well, this conversation has been really great, and we are approaching the end of it, and I have a couple of rapid-fire closing questions.
Well, I hope I'm able to answer them as rapidly as you ask them.
No, the answers don't have to be rapid, so so feel free to take your time. What is the best advice you have ever received?
To have a life worth living, to have a meaningful life.
Okay. The next question is there something you believe that most people disagree with you about?
I have no idea. I can't answer the question. No answer.
Okay. Yeah, these are very tricky. And finally, I have a question about love. And a facet of love is one thing, but if one thing creates suffering, how can one be happy while being in love?
Well, it depends what you mean by love. There are different degrees of love. Most of love is selfish. Basically, it's a need. I love you, please love me. It's a sort of unspoken contract often, yes. And when the person whom we love dies, then we're in trouble if we're over-attached. It's inevitable that somebody that we're in love with and familiar with, when they pass away, there will be an inevitable sadness and disappointment. But true love accepts everything as it is and loves everything as it is. So it's a question of the order of love. Love gives rise to suffering because with love, there is a sense of connection. And with sense of connection, there is a degree of empathy and involvement. As I was saying earlier, if we feel for others and have empathy for others, we feel their suffering. It's how we respond to that suffering. So essentially, at the end of the day, we have no choice if we're intelligent, both intellectually and emotionally, but to accept the nature of phenomena as it is. And at that point, love is an enriched experience which allows us to connect with others, it allows us to suffer with others. But if we are to any degree realized, we're able to see it as part of a bigger process, at which point we find peace again.
Well, thank you very much for the conversation and for that answer. And with that, well, I guess we can conclude the podcast.
Well, let me say thank you. I've really enjoyed your questions. I enjoyed your questions on the retreat, and I've enjoyed your questions and engaging with you in this conversation on the podcast. So thank you very much. Well,
again, thank you very much too. And I definitely enjoyed talking to you. And again, just an extra thank you for being so clear about it, because I think the subject is just so abstract. And at least to my ear, you really hit the nail on the head.
Well, I'll just say about the abstractness. We're asking big questions. And the answers are very simple, but it does take a while to get one's head and heart around them. So it's a question of persevering with the inquiry, persevering with the curiosity towards something that one intuits as correct, but one has to know for oneself. And it's a gradual process of transformation. In Western psychology, it would be defined as individuation or actualization. In Eastern terminology, Buddhist terminology, it would be called a process of enlightenment, of waking up to the way things are. So just be patient and persevere, and the results will be there.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. And for those of you who are listening to this from Latvia, I just want to share that Nick will be in Latvia again on November 9th to 11th, where he will be leading a weekend-long retreat for anyone who's interested, actually. I do recommend visiting it. I did my first retreat led by Nick. It was a week-long event, and he's a very good instructor. He can really point things out very clearly without any of the woo-woo that sometimes tends to come with spiritual teachings and our inner emotional lives in general. You can read more about it in anjali.lv, that's Anjali with a J, and I will put a link in the description. So thank you and goodbye.